Hello, the purpose of this recording is to give you an introduction to the practice of close reading. And at the end of the video, you should be able to define close reading and also be able to explain how it can be implemented in a classroom setting. So first of all, let's talk about what exactly is close reading. So close reading is deeply reading a text for the purpose of comprehension, really knowing what the text is saying, not just having a superficial understanding of the text's meaning. And close reading often involves reading a short, complex text multiple times, sometimes twice, sometimes 3 or more times, depending on how hard the text is and what kind of meaning you are trying to extract from the text. It also involves some scaffolding on the part of the teacher by asking questions and talking about what the text is saying, and it also involves discussion of the text between students and also between the students and the teacher. And close reading isn't something new. It's something that many good readers, especially college students and graduate students like yourselves, have been doing in university settings for quite some time, because as you know, in college courses, a lot of the information that you learn comes from reading texts. And sometimes those textbooks that you have to read in graduate school, in college as well as an undergrad, really require you to pay close attention to them and really understand what they're saying, because they're not quite so easy. It's not like picking up a novel and reading a novel at the beach, right? They're a little bit more intense. So it's not something new. However, close reading has received a great deal of attention in the literacy field in recent years, largely because of the implementation of the Common Core state standards. So I know that, within this class, a lot of you study different disciplines like biology and math and social studies and so forth, so you might not be as familiar with the Common Core state standards for literacy. But one of the most important standards, one of the anchor standards, and an anchor standard is a standard or a goal that a student should be able to achieve upon graduating from 12th grade. One of the anchor standards for reading is that students should be able to read a text closely to determine what it says and to be able to make inferences from the text. We also expect that at the end of 12th grade, students should be able to go back to the text and draw conclusions using details cited in the text. And certainly we expect younger students to be able to do these things as well, just on a slightly different scale. So a lot of the attention that close reading has received in recent years has been due to this anchor standard number 1 that indicates that students need to be able to engage in close reading. So close reading involves a few different things. So, of course, it involves reading the text, and it also involves annotating the text. And we'll talk about that more in just a moment, but when we talk about annotating a text, we're talking about making notes with the text and interacting with it in order to increase our engagement and our understanding of what the text is saying. I know that when I read with a pencil in my hand or with a highlighter in my hand, I am reading more actively and paying more attention to what I'm reading because I'm trying to have a conversation with the text in a way. So usually with a close reading, and there are other variations of close reading that you might encounter, but this is just one way of doing it. Students will read the text one time just to get the gist, to get the main idea and some of the key details. Then they will talk with other students about the main idea and the overall gist of the article or the text that they read. Then students reread the text a second time, but this time they're rereading the text with specific questions in mind. And those questions are often determined by the teacher in advance of the close reading. So as students are rereading the text, what they're looking for is evidence to support their answers to the questions. So that's also when they're going to be annotating the text. They're also going to be taking notes about what the text is saying in relation to the questions. So a close reading will involve reading a text at least 2 times, but oftentimes students might need to read a text more than twice to really be able to answer those questions and unlock the meaning of what the text is saying. So, and sometimes following a close reading of a text selection, students will write some sort of a written response, like respond to an essay prompt or something along those lines, but not always. So this is a system of annotation that you are welcome to adapt and teach in your own classroom, but these are just some common marks that we can teach students how to make when they are doing a close read. And certainly if your students are using a textbook owned by a school district, you probably cannot have them annotate in the text. However, when you do a close read, if you're able to, say, photocopy pages out of the textbook and distribute them to the students for the purpose of annotating them, that would be most helpful. Or certainly in content area teaching, you certainly are likely to supplement the textbook with some other materials like articles and whatnot. So with annotation, we teach students how to circle parts of the text where they feel confused. We can also teach them how to underline or highlight when they encounter main ideas, as well as key details that are important that support those main ideas. Question marks for questions about the text. Then we have exclamation points when students want to make note of parts of the text that they find especially interesting. And then we can also teach students how to make margin notes in the text. So if you have an idea or a comment or some kind of connection to the text, we can teach students how to take margin notes. And sometimes what I do when I'm close reading, I sometimes, if I encounter part of the text that is worded awkwardly or it's really hard for me to understand and I have to read it over and over again to really understand what it's saying, I will often paraphrase what the text is saying in my own words in the margin, so that way when I go back later to study it or to use it for some purpose, I kind of have my own summary of that part of the text that I can refer back to instead of trying to figure out what a dense and technical part of the text means a second time. I can just look at my own notes. And, I'm not talking about close reading because it's necessarily part of the course curriculum. It is something I should be teaching you, certainly. However, I also feel like it's been useful for me personally. I know that, as a professor in college, I've been to school a really long time. And certainly I've taken a lot of courses that required me to closely read text. For example, I've taken 800 level statistics courses, and that's really not my area of strength, so I often had to read my assigned textbook chapters very carefully, and it would take me several hours, and I would frequently reread and make margin notes and highlight things and underline, formulas that I needed to know to do my homework assignments. So it's really not just, I'm not just giving lip service to some, reading technique. I actually find this really useful, and I think you will too, not only in your own graduate studies, but also as a technique for teaching students how to read their textbooks and other materials that you'll be presenting to them in your content area teaching. So I wanted to just show you a few examples of close reading that I've done. In one of my classes, we do a thematic unit about the civil rights movement, and I model for students how to integrate language arts methods along with social studies content in an undergraduate class I teach here at USM. And we read a biography about Claudette Colvin, and she was a teenager who stood up to segregation by refusing to give up her seat on a Montgomery public bus. And that story sounds familiar. You might think, oh gosh, wasn't that Rosa Parks? Well, Rosa Parks actually did it 9 months after Claudette Colvin, but Claudette Colvin has been lost to history. So anyway, just to give you some context about what this is all about. So as part of that thematic unit that I teach students, I have students read an article from the Montgomery Advertiser published in December of 1955. So this occurred after Claudette Colvin took a stand on the Montgomery bus, and just very shortly after Rosa Parks took her stand, and the African American people of Montgomery decided that they were going to begin a boycott of the Montgomery buses in order to achieve equity and justice. So I have students close read this article from the Advertiser, and it works really well for a close reading for several reasons. One, it's short. As you can see, it's only 1 page long. And two, this is a complex text, and you might think, gosh, it's just a newspaper article reporting on events, but it's actually, I would consider this a complex text because, quite frankly, it's not very well written. The sequence of events is all over the place, and as a reader, you really have to make an inference, or lots of inferences really, about how the different events that are outlined in the article are connected to each other. Like, what's the relationship between event A and event B, and so on. And a lot of students report that it's really hard to read. It's really difficult for that reason. It's just not really good writing, which is understandable because a lot of newspaper reporters end up having to write quickly because they're on deadlines. So maybe attention to style isn't always their top concern. But anyway, this article is great for a close read. So what I have students do with this particular article is I have them use this graphic organizer that you see on your screen. And in the first read, what I have students do is just think about the main ideas. Like, what are some of the main events that the author of the article from the Montgomery Advertiser is noting? And some of those include things like a bullet clipping the side of a bus. It's about the African American community gathering at, I think it was the Holt Street Baptist Church, to decide they were going to boycott the buses. It also talks about the arrest of Rosa Parks. And several other events. So in your first reading, I'm just asking students to pay attention to what are those main events. Then I have them go back and I have them read the article a second time. And what I want them to look for when they are doing the second reading of the article is to consider the author's position. What are the author's beliefs, and what biases does the author demonstrate in this particular article? Now, we know, journalists are supposed to be objective, but also I believe that no text or no language is ever neutral. So I think that everything inherently has a bias. So what I have students do is to try to unpack that bias and see what the author really thinks about what's going on in Montgomery at this particular time. So on their second reading, they're looking at this article again with that question in mind, like, what does the author believe about what's happening in Montgomery? And as they're reading, what they do is they annotate the text as I showed you on a previous slide, but I also have them list their ideas as bullet points in this graphic organizer so they can take notes. And then when we finish doing both readings, both the first reading and the second reading, I have students stop and talk in pairs about what are some of the things that they wrote down in their graphic organizer, and then we talk as a whole class, and then we move on. And I find that after doing the second reading and students have made their notes, like I demonstrate here on the slide, we have a lot of rich discussion, and students are really able to grab specific phrases and quotes from the text to cite their beliefs about what the author thinks about the events in Montgomery. For example, I think that the author is really against what is happening in Montgomery at that time. For example, in the article, he points out how the meeting at the Holt Street Baptist Church was an inconvenience to traffic. Instead of looking at it as people who are coming together for to achieve a common good, at least from their perspective, he portrays it like a big inconvenience to the traffic flow in Montgomery. And he also leaves out some information that is important. For example, he portrays Rosa Parks as a criminal instead of someone who was actually taking a very deliberate stand against segregation, against the Jim Crow laws. He leaves out the fact that Rosa Parks was a longtime activist in the NAACP. That information is missing. So, as I go through and I read this, I can, make a lot of notes about why I believe the author is biased against the activities happening in Montgomery. He's not in favor of the emerging bus boycott. And the students do the same thing, and, having this evidence in front of them on the graphic organizer and specific quotes from the text really helps facilitate a robust discussion. So I always enjoy teaching that lesson because it's just really lively. It's a fun day in class. And to give you another example, in another class I've taught, I model for students how to do close reading using some newspaper articles related to a book that we read in the class. The book is called Carcapo Rescue, Saving the World's Strangest Parrot by Cy Montgomery and Nick Bishop. And it's an informational book about this species of parrots that live in New Zealand, and they are very close to extinction. They have about 100 left in the world. And I have them read contemporary newspaper articles about the Carcapo parrots because I want students to recognize how fragile the Carcapo parrots really are and how difficult it is for volunteers and other people involved in rescuing them to save this group of parrots from extinction. So I have them read this article about how volunteers in New Zealand actually were able to save a Carcapo parrot egg that was cracked and was actually able to hatch successfully, so students could see like the great lengths that have to be that people have to go through to save these particular birds when they're placed in danger, especially in that vulnerable stage when they're still in the egg stage. Then I have them read another article about a couple of Carcapo parrots that just seem to die mysteriously and no one really knows what happened to them. And the students consider, you know, again, just how fragile, you know, these Carcapo parrots are, and that, you know, just the smallest thing can cause them to die. So ultimately, you know, I actually have them read these particular articles 3 times. And then what I have them do when they're done reading both articles 3 times is I have them put those articles together and think about them side by side. I have them synthesize the articles and think about, are the Carcapo parrots a fragile species? So that's really the main question. And what they do is they think about evidence from both of the articles and they put those together. They synthesize those to be able to answer the question. And again, I ask them to use evidence from the articles to support their thinking. So that's just, you know, I just wanted to give you a couple examples of how a close reading works. But this week in the Blackboard folder, you will also find a link that shows you a lesson of a 10th grade English teacher who is actually implementing a close reading with her students. So you'll be able to see some other examples of close reading this week. And I hope that it's a technique that you start trying out yourself in your courses, and also one that you implement in your content area teaching, because I do believe if you do it right, it'll be very helpful to your students. Let me know if you have any questions, and thank you.